Hello and welcome to PT and Nutrition Education's e-learning platform. Today we'll be continuing the preparation for your examination in anatomy and physiology, and as you can see, today's topic will be related to the muscular system. Throughout the video you're going to be asked to complete a task booklet which will help to consolidate your learning, so we do recommend that you download that. You can find this on the website on the link below. And as well, during the video you're going to be asked to pause and take part in some interactive tasks. Again, we advise that you do take part in these as it will help to consolidate your learning and increase your memory. So the content and the objectives that we'll be covering for the muscular system at level 2 is as follows. The first thing is we're going to identify the key skeletal muscles of the anatomy. Then we're going to identify and describe the different types of muscle found within the body. We're going to look at how muscles move, including some of the key terms that surround muscle movement. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at the different muscle fibre types that we have and the characteristics for each. So of course, if we're doing the muscular system, it makes sense that we start by naming the key muscles of the human anatomy. But before we do that, I want to set you a task straight off the bat, just to test your pre-existing knowledge on the muscular system. So there is an interactive task labelled Task 2.1 on the website. So if you just click on that link, it should take you to this task and you can identify some of the muscles that you already know. Once we've done that, we can reconvene here on the video and go through some of the key muscles of the anatomy that you need to know for your examination. Okay, well done. So regardless of your score, of course, we can consolidate now some of the key areas of the muscular system that you need to be aware of when it comes to naming the muscles. So let's make a start. Before we do start though, one thing that you need to be aware of when it comes to anatomy is when we look at somebody from the front side, this is what's known as an anterior view. And when we look at somebody from the back side, this is what's known as a posterior view. So this is just important to bear in mind for some of the muscles which do have the words posterior and anterior in them. Okay, so let's start off here with the trapezius. Okay, so the trapezius is either side of the neck, and as you can see, we can see the trapezius from both a posterior view and also an anterior view. Okay, you can see it makes up quite a large area of your upper back as well. Okay, so this supports the neck, also supports the shoulders, and assists with any upper back movement that we have. Okay, so that's the trapezius. The second one you may be aware of is the shoulder, of course, and we identify this as the deltoid. So the deltoid will help us to abduct and adduct, to flex and extend and circumduct the shoulder. So it's the deltoid which enables to do that. There are other muscles at play, and the shoulder is a very complex joint. It's a ball and socket joint, as you're aware. So there's many muscles around that area which provide movement and also support to the shoulder. Pectoralis major. Now, the reason why this is called the pectoralis major is because we also have a pectoralis minor, which is situated just underneath the pectoralis major in this area here, which I'm pointing to with my cursor. So pectoralis major, of course, makes up a huge part of the chest and is the key chest muscle. Bicep brachii. Now, we can't just identify the biceps as the biceps, we have to identify them as the bicep brachii. So as you're aware, this is a large muscle on the upper forearm which helps to flex the forearm. So any kind of dumbbell curl, for example, will of course require the bicep brachii to contract. The serratus anterior, these are the muscles which look kind of like the ribs, so they are actually situated on the ribs at the side of the body, at the side of the abdominals, and it's the serratus anterior here which you need to identify. Underneath that, and most people get these two mixed up, or sometimes just identify the serratus anterior as the obliques. The obliques, once again, reside at the side of the rectus abdominis, so the six-pack muscle, and the obliques here provide stability to your core. The six-pack muscles are the rectus abdominis, the quadriceps. Now the quadriceps, as the name suggests, is made up of 4 individual muscles. So the quadriceps is actually a group of muscles. You have to know each individual quadricep when it comes to both your level 2 and level 3 examination. So we have 4 muscles that you need to be aware of. The rectus femoris, okay, which you can see here, is the large muscle on the front of the quadricep here. The vastus medialis, so this is the teardrop muscle we find here on the inner side of the quadricep. Now, again, like we said before with anterior and posterior views, when it comes to anatomy, if we imagine a line that goes straight down the middle of a person, if we're close to that midline, this is known as medial. And if we're going away from that midline, then this is known as lateral. So this will help you to identify the vastus medialis, which is here on the medial part of the quadricep. The vastus intermedius we can't actually see in the picture here. We would have to remove the rectus femoris, which is the large quadricep muscle here, to actually see the vastus intermedius, which resides deeper than the rectus femoris. And the vastus lateralis, which we find on the outside of the quadricep. As I mentioned before, if we're towards the outside of the midline, then this is known as lateral. So this is a way in which you can remember or distinguish between the vastus medialis and the vastus lateralis. In the quadricep as well, but not part of the quadricep muscle, in the upper thigh, we have actually the longest muscle in the body, which is the sartorius. So this starts all the way up near the pelvis and goes down all the way to the medial side of the knee. This is the sartorius. The tibialis anterior, as you can see, we are in the anterior view here because this model is facing forward. And the tibialis, given that it attaches to the tibia, which you'll be aware of from doing the skeletal system. So the tibialis anterior is the muscle on the front of the shin, which is more to the lateral side. Okay, moving on to the posterior side of the body. As we've already identified, the trapezius can be seen from both anterior and posterior views. The erector spinae, now we can't physically see this because the trapezius is covering, and also we would have to remove the latissimus dorsi and the trapezius in order to get a good view of it. But the erector spinae is a muscle which goes all the way down the spine on either side. So it adds stability and enables you to keep the vertebrae erect when standing straight. Okay, now we may have heard of the rotator cuff before. Many people refer to the rotator cuff, and it's a group of muscles, not an individual muscle, that we find near the shoulder. Okay, so the 4 muscles which make up the rotator cuff are the teres minor, the infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and subscapularis. Okay, so they can actually help to do all of the things the deltoid helps your shoulder to do, which is to flex, to extend, to circumduct, to rotate, but also it helps with scapular retraction, scapular protraction. So it's a very complicated joint, as we're aware of, and there are many muscles involved which enable that movement to occur. The latissimus dorsi is the largest back muscle, which you can find here in the middle back, all the way down to the lower back as well. And we find this either side of the erector spinae, and is pivotal in a lot of pulling movements. The tricep brachii, just like the bicep brachii, we need to know this, not just as the triceps, but the triceps brachii. The gluteus medius. Now, the gluteus, of course, is the buttocks, and the gluteus is actually made up of 3 different muscles. The gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, and then, of course, the gluteus maximus. So the gluteus medius we find on the lateral aspect of the glute. The pronator teres, as we mentioned before when we did the skeletal system, this enables you to pronate your forearm. So remember, this is doable through the radio ulnar joint, where we're able to pronate and supinate the forearm. So it's the pronator teres which enables you to pronate your forearm. The gluteus maximus, which is the largest muscle in the body, and of course this is pivotal for things like hip extension. So the top part of the squat, we get a lot of power through the gluteus maximus, and it's becoming more noticeable as a very important muscle in sports performance. The hamstrings, just like the quadriceps, they are actually made up of a number of muscles, so it's a group of muscles which the hamstrings is made up of. These are known as the bicep femoris, which is the large hamstring muscle that you can see here, which enables you to flex your knee. The semitendinosus, okay, which we actually find on the outside of the 3 hamstring muscles, and the semimembranosus, which we find on the inside of the 3 hamstring muscles. The gastrocnemius, which is also known as your calf, is the muscle in your lower limb. And then last but not least, we have the soleus. So the soleus is a muscle that we find underneath the gastrocnemius, and it simply just aids the gastroc in any of the movements that the gastroc is involved in. So in order to see the soleus in its entirety, we'd have to remove the gastrocnemius, which sits underneath. Okay, so that brings us to an end of the key muscles related to your level 2, level 3 criteria. So in order to consolidate this even further, we now have 2 options. The first option is that you can retake the interactive task that you did at the start and see how you have improved based on watching this slide and practicing for yourself. Or secondly, within your work booklet, you have a sheet which looks practically similar to what we've just been through, and you can handwrite or you can type out some of the muscles for this task, which you can find in the first page of your task booklet. So pause the video, have a go at those 2 tasks to consolidate your learning, and then we will continue on to the next topic in the muscular system. So the next part of the muscular system is related to the different types of muscle that the body has. Now, all of the muscles that we've just been through on the previous slide are related to only one specific type of muscle that we find in the body. And in fact, there are 3 different types of muscle tissue that you need to be aware of. So the first one is cardiac muscle, the second one is smooth muscle, and the one that we've just been through and we are probably most aware of are skeletal muscles. So each one has their own set of characteristics which you need to be aware of. So as we go through the next few slides talking about each individual type of muscle, you can make some notes which is in your task booklet. So again, this can provide you with any kind of revision when it comes to taking your exam. So the first muscle that we're going to focus on is the cardiac muscle. Now, as the name suggests, the word cardiac means heart. So we're referring to the heart muscle here, and this is the example that you must give if you're asked about an example of the cardiac muscle. Now, cardiac muscle is very unique in that it has some very different characteristics when compared to skeletal and smooth muscle. One of which is the fact that cardiac muscle does not fatigue. Okay, so it can go literally from before you're born until the moment that you die. Cardiac muscle does not get tired. Okay, not only that, it can also speed up, it can slow down based on thought patterns, adrenaline, the onset of exercise. Okay, so it has some very unique characteristics in that respect. Cardiac muscle is also involuntary, so it is the automatic nervous system which controls the speeding up and slowing down of your heart rate. Okay, so the cardiac control center, which we find in a specific part of the brain, will control your heart via the automatic nervous system, but we'll go into more detail about that when we do the circulatory system. And of course, the main function of the heart, as you are already aware, is that it is to circulate blood and deliver oxygen around to the working muscles, and of course to pick up CO2 and deliver that back to the lungs where we can exhale it. So cardiac muscle, a pivotal muscle within the body. The second type of muscle that we find in the body is known as smooth muscle. Now the reason it's called smooth muscle is because of its appearance. It has a smooth appearance, which is unlike skeletal muscle, which is striated, but we'll talk more about that in the next slide. Now smooth muscle we find mostly in our digestive system and also in our blood vessels. It has weak contractions, but they are slow and sustained, and just like cardiac muscle, it is involuntary, meaning that we do not have conscious control over our smooth muscle. So in terms of its function, because it's slow, weak contractions, but they are sustained and they are involuntary, it helps to propel food through your digestive system. So we find smooth muscle on the walls of our intestines, so the small intestine and large intestine. As we move food through the intestinal tract and we start to absorb the nutrients from that, it is the smooth muscle which helps that food to pass through from your stomach to your intestines eventually until you have to expel that food. Additionally, in the blood vessels, this helps to propel blood through the body as well. So the blood doesn't just travel through high blood pressure, it also is enabled to travel through the contraction of smooth muscle on the blood vessel walls. So again, these are slow and sustained, and for example, these can help venous return, which is blood returning against the force of gravity as it returns back to the heart. So it's smooth muscle, yet again, a key muscle that we find in the body. And then the final type of muscle that we find in the body is skeletal muscle. So this is where we're talking about the muscles which we've named in the very first slide. So this is also known as striated muscle because it has a striped appearance. Now, the reason for this striped appearance is that we have two protein filaments within our muscle which enable your muscle to contract, and these are known as actin and myosin. So for example, if you look on somebody that is very lean and you were, for example, to look at the deltoid, you would actually see these actin and myosin filaments arranged in lines. Okay, so it's the striped appearance of the muscle which enables it to contract. Now these contractions can be very strong. Okay, so we have a great ability to produce a lot of force within our muscles. Now, unlike cardiac muscle and unlike smooth muscle, we have conscious control over these contractions. So we can voluntarily contract our skeletal muscle in order to produce force. And of course, this enables us to partake in the gym exercises that we do, lift the weights that we do, overcome the resistances that we do, and of course play sport, move around and move the skeleton. So skeletal muscles, they're attached to the skeleton and they are voluntary, allowing movement to occur. Okay, so just a great little video which will conclude everything that we've just been through on skeletal muscle and also give you a really good insight into how muscles produce force is available on the website. So if you just click on the link which is labelled video 1, and this will give you a really good overview of skeletal muscle contraction. So that's the second objective for the muscular system complete. And once again, just to consolidate your learning, there is an interactive task which you can complete on the link below. So if you go to the link and then match up the different characteristics and examples for the different types of muscle, this should consolidate this objective so we can move on. Good luck. Now, when it comes to skeletal muscle, this is where we're going to be spending most of our time, given that movement is at the forefront of everything you do as a personal trainer. So we're going to look at how muscles and bones interact and how some of the structures and parts of the anatomy work together in order to produce movement. Now, skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton via a connective tissue known as a tendon. So it's tendons which pull on the bone and actually make them work as levers. So when a bicep is innervated through electrical stimulation, that signal will then travel through the tendon and pull on the bone, as we say, to produce movement. You may notice that the tendon actually crosses over the joint, which functions as a fulcrum during that movement. So when the lever is pulled through that electrical stimulation and through that mechanical tension, it is the fulcrum which enables that fixed point in which the lever can move. Now once we have all of those in place and the muscle is contracting, then the limb will move and we've produced movement. You also may notice that when a muscle is working, so this is known as the agonist, so this is the prime mover, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, we have a muscle which is doing the opposite, which is relaxing. So in the case of elbow flexion, you'll notice that the bicep is contracting, okay, which is then producing that flexion, but the triceps are relaxing, okay. So this is known as the antagonist, and muscles work in pairs, and it's important to remember that as we move forward. You'll see there that when the opposite is happening, so when we have elbow extension, you can see that the bicep relaxes and it is the tricep which is contracting in order to straighten the elbow, okay? So muscles do work in pairs, but the key takeaway point from this is that muscles and bones are working together through the connective tissue of a tendon in order to produce movement. So just before we delve deeper into muscle movement, one thing that you need to be aware of is the structures of skeletal muscle and some of the functions that they undertake. Now to start with, we already are aware of the role of skeletal muscle attaching to bone via connective tissue known as tendon. So it's the tendon that is able to conduct those electrical and mechanical impulses which allow bone to move. Now, the first structure that you need to be aware of is the epimysium. Now, the epimysium is actually a sheath of fibrous connective tissue that surrounds the outer layer of the muscle. Now, if you've ever undertook in any kind of foam rolling or myofascial release, it's actually the epimysium which is being worked here. Now, the epimysium can actually attach very closely to the lower layers of a muscle. But when you foam roll, what you're doing is you are releasing some of that fascia and therefore creating sliding surfaces so that muscle can move more freely, which is why it might be easier for you to, for example, touch your toes after doing some foam rolling on your calves and your hamstrings. This is because the sheath has been released and sliding surfaces are now present. The second one is, of course, blood vessels. Now, blood vessels, as we are aware, allow you to deliver oxygen and also to remove CO2 from the tissue. So it's vitally important that during any kind of oxidative respiration that's using oxygen to produce energy, the blood vessels are able to deliver that oxygen to the working muscles and also remove CO2, which can also increase the acidity in the muscle and therefore stop them from working as optimally as they can. So once we get past the epimysium, you'll notice that these muscles now are arranged into bundles. So it's individual muscle fibers within the bundle, and that's surrounded by connective tissue which is known as the perimysium. So much like the epimysium, this is now just a deeper layer of connective tissue which harbours all of these individual bundles which contain muscle fibres. And as we zoom even deeper into those individual muscle fibres, we see here that again another layer of connective tissue known as the endomysium, endo meaning within the muscle, surrounds each individual muscle fibre. And these individual muscle fibres are known as myofibrils. So earlier you may have remembered we talked about striated muscle having a striped appearance due to the protein filaments actin and myosin, and these are the individual myofibrils, actin and myosin, where contraction is occurring. And the last structure we haven't mentioned is the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is actually the membrane which surrounds these individual myofibrils and contains the sarcoplasm, where biochemical reactions can take place in order for energy to be available so that myofibrils can contract. We're going to talk more about muscle contraction in relation to the sliding filament theory, but that is related to more level 3 criteria. For now, the takeaway points and the structures that you need to be aware of are the tendon, the epimysium, the perimysium, the endomysium, the myofibrils, actin and myosin, and the sarcolemma, which is the membrane surrounding those individual muscle fibers. Now, when it comes to muscle movement, there are 4 key terms which you need to be aware of. The first key term is what's known as the agonist. Now, the agonist is the working muscle during any given movement. So, if we take, for example, the bicep curl, on both the upward and downward phases of the bicep curl, it's the bicep brachii which is the primary muscle, the prime mover, which is being worked during that movement. More often than not, it is the muscle which shortens during contraction as well. So this is what's known as concentric contraction, which we'll speak about a little later. Now, for every agonist, there is an antagonist. Now, the antagonist does the opposite job to the prime mover. So this is the muscle which is lengthening and relaxing whilst the agonist works. Okay? And it's also controlling the movement to make sure that we don't injure ourselves, and essentially acts like a brake. So we use the bicep curl as an example for the antagonist, then it's the tricep brachii which is the example muscle in this scenario. So as we're now aware, we understand that muscles do not work in isolation, they're in fact working in teams. So it's not just the agonist and antagonist which are working together, we also have what's known as a synergist. Now, a synergist is a muscle which is working with the agonist and helping it to perform better. Essentially, it's controlling and directing the movement of the agonist and altering its position into the most advantageous spot. Okay, so if we take, for example, the bicep curl, the example we were using earlier, and the agonist is the bicep brachii, the antagonist is the tricep brachii, the synergist is in fact the brachialis. Now, this is a muscle which sits underneath the bicep brachii, and this is the synergist during that bicep curl. This is because it's helping the bicep brachii to fulfill its movement. And then the last key term that you need to be aware of is what's known as the fixator. So this completes a team of muscles which are working together in order to produce movement. And the fixator is all about keeping the muscle stabilized and the joint in a stable position so that our posture and our technique can be maintained. So again, if we talk about the example of the bicep curl, we have the brachialis, which is the synergist. The fixator during this movement, if we want to keep our elbow and our shoulder in a fixated position so that we can fully work the agonist of the bicep, then we can have the fixator as the deltoid. So the cap of the shoulder is keeping the elbow and keeping the humerus in a nice stabilized position so that the bicep can fulfill its contraction. So now we look at the different types of contraction. There are 3 that you need to be aware of for your examination. The first one is what's known as concentric contraction. So this describes when a muscle is shortening under tension. So again, if we use the bicep curl as our example, you can see from the picture here that during the upward phase of the bicep curl, it's the bicep brachii which is shortening, and this is referred to as concentric contraction. So whenever a muscle is working and whenever the muscle is shortening, you refer to it as concentric contraction. The opposite to concentric contraction is eccentric contraction. Now this describes when a muscle is working but it is lengthening. So again, if we use the bicep curl as the example, on the downward phase of the bicep curl, the bicep is actually lengthening, and this is referred to as eccentric contraction because it is still under tension when the muscle lengthens. And the third and final type of contraction is what's known as isometric contraction. So this is where there is no movement, whereas the muscle is still under tension. So the muscle doesn't change in length, however the muscle is still under tension and therefore still working. This has been shown to increase gains in strength, but only at the point of contraction. So some examples of isometric contraction you can see here. We have a wall sit, where somebody will be stationary sat against the wall, where their legs are bent at 90 degrees. And here we have lots of tension going through the quadriceps and the hamstrings. So this is the point of contraction where strength will increase. The same goes for an abdominal bridge. You can see here that the point of contraction is going to be at the rectus abdominis, and therefore this is the muscle which will be worked during isometric contraction. So if we combine this all together and start to look at muscle movement and muscle contraction, we should be able to start to identify movement patterns on the human body and being able to identify the agonist, antagonist, synergist and fixator based on the movement that is occurring. So if we take this picture here of David Beckham and we look at his right leg, as you can see, what we've got there is flexion at the knee joint. In order for him to prepare to strike the ball, he lifts his leg back and bends his knee, and therefore we've created flexion. So therefore, the agonist in this movement is going to be the hamstrings. So the hamstrings are made up of the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus and the bicep femoris. And it's concentric contraction that we're getting in the hamstring here, which again enables us to identify the hamstrings as the agonist. Now, as we said, muscles are working in teams, and when we talk about the agonist and antagonist, we're talking about muscles working in pairs. So the antagonist and the opposite to the hamstring is the quadriceps. So the quadriceps are made up of the vastae muscles and the rectus femoris, and this is acting as a brake as David Beckham flexes his right knee. In addition, the fixator, so which is holding his body in place and holding the joint in place and keeping him stable, is the rectus abdominis, the external obliques, and also the hip flexors. So these muscles are just keeping the joints in a stabilized position so that he can fulfill that movement action. And then lastly, the synergist, so helping the hamstrings in order to flex the knee. We're talking about here the gluteus maximus and the gluteus minimus. So these muscles are aiding him to bend his knee and also to create that force potential which is going to be transferred into the ball. If we take another example and we look at David Beckham's left shoulder, we can identify here that this movement is abduction. So he's moving his humerus, his arm, away from the midline of the body. In order to do that, the agonist is the deltoid. Now at the same time, we've got concentric contraction again because the deltoid is shortening. The antagonist, so the muscle which is working against the agonist and therefore acting as a brake, well, there are two muscles here which are doing that job, and that's the pectoralis major. As you can see, the chest will actually stretch out and act as a brake for the deltoid, and also the latissimus dorsi. So the latissimus dorsi once again will stretch, elongate, and therefore act as a brake for the agonist. The synergist, so helping the deltoid to abduct the shoulder, is the trapezius, and also of course we've got three different parts to the deltoid. We've got the posterior, anterior and middle deltoid. So the synergist here is going to be the trapezius, and if we want to get really technical, we can identify the posterior deltoid as one of the synergists. And then the fixator, holding that shoulder joint in place, making sure that we don't hyperextend or we don't hyperabduct and therefore cause injury. We've got the teres major, which is part of the shoulder girdle, and also the infraspinatus, which again makes up the rotator cuff. So these muscles here are working in teams in order for those movement actions to occur. Now once again, we can consolidate now our muscle movements and our muscle contractions in your work booklet. So if you turn to the muscle movement page, you've got there the 4 key terms of muscle movement and the muscle contractions, where you can write a definition for each. In addition to that, it's also worth noting that there is an additional booklet that you can download and you can fill out, which will help you to solidify all of the movements of the human body and being able to identify the agonists, antagonists, synergists and fixators at different joints. This is particularly important for you as a personal trainer to be able to identify the type of contractions that are occurring, where the joints and the muscles are working together to produce movement, so that you can then program any particular types of movement within your client's training programs to help with any particular areas that they wish to work on. So you can find this underneath the video under the muscle movement booklet. So when we are talking about muscle fibers, as we've already mentioned, there are hundreds and thousands of muscle fibers that we have in our skeletal muscle. Now if we were to zoom in or to dissect a muscle, as we've already mentioned, we have hundreds of thousands of myofibrils. And each one of these myofibrils, which are also known as muscle fibers or muscle cells, have a unique set of characteristics which play a certain role when it comes to exercise and exercise performance. Now, these are what are known as muscle fiber types, and we have 3 different muscle fiber types which you need to be aware of. First off, they are put into 2 categories, and these 2 categories are known as slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. Now, the slow twitch fibers, these are known as the type 1 fibers. The fast twitch fibers are known as type 2A and type 2B. Now, there are subtle differences between type 2A and type 2B, and also big differences between fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. Now, what's important to understand is that the type of muscle fiber characteristics that we have are dependent on our genetics and also can be dependent from muscle to muscle. So, for example, if we take the quadricep and we were to dissect that, we would actually find about 50% type 1 and also 50% fast twitch fibers within that individual muscle. Whereas if we took the soleus, for example, then we would find that about 80% of those muscle fibers in the soleus are made up of slow twitch fibers and only 20% are made up of fast twitch. So we never get really in the muscle belly 100% of one type of the muscle fiber. There is a change between the different types of fibers depending on the role of the muscle and also the type of activity that the individual do when it comes to their training, for example. Now, when it comes to the type 2B fibers, it's also worth noting that depending on the textbook that you read, they are now referred to most of the time as type 2X fibers. So more updated textbooks will read type 2B fibers as type 2X fibers. And of course, these are the most explosive fast twitch of all of the fibers that we have. Now, the 3 that we've identified, type 1, type 2A, type 2X, these are all pure muscle fiber types. Now, what we do have is a sliding scale where some fibers can have mixed qualities, and these are referred to as hybrid fibers. So if we take, for example, a fiber that we may find which is say 80% type 1 and 20% type 2A, okay, then it would exist somewhere around here on the scale. But as well, we have muscle fibers which are more type 2A, therefore more fast twitch than they are type 1. However, they do have characteristics of both, and then of course we would find it somewhere further up the scale here. This is the same for hybrids between type 2A fibers and also type 2X fibers, which again can have hybrid characteristics. Now, what characteristics are we talking about? Why on this picture do we have what's referred to as red muscle or white muscle? We're going to discuss that now in the upcoming slides. But so the takeaway in terms of the introduction for muscle fibers is that we can have pure muscle fibers of slow twitch, we can have pure muscle fibers of fast twitch, but we also have individual muscle cells, individual myofibrils, which do have a mixture of both type 1, type 2A and type 2B, type 2X characteristics. Now, just before we go into detail about the different fiber types, and as you can see, the first one we're going to focus on are type 1 fibers, I want to direct you to a fantastic video which outlines the different fiber types and how they can be used when it comes to sports performance. So if you just pause the lecture now and you go to the video YouTube link, which is just below, muscle fiber video, and if you just watch the 5-minute video, it gives you a really good brief understanding and introduction into the individual fiber types. Okay, so the first muscle fiber is the type 1 slow twitch fiber. So as we saw from the previous slide, this muscle fiber is red, and it's red in colour due to its rich blood supply. And of course, if it has a rich blood supply, this tells us that it is an oxygenated muscle cell. Okay, now because it's oxygenated, it is therefore resistant to fatigue. Now, provided that we've got a nice delivery of oxygen to the working muscle at the type 1 fiber, then we will continue to produce energy in the presence of oxygen, and therefore aerobic respiration is taking place. Now, because we're using oxygen and therefore the fuels that we're going to be using are carbohydrate and fat, then we get slow and sustained contractions which aren't necessarily very powerful, but we're able to contract the muscle repeatedly without fatigue. So we get slow and sustained contractions. Now, because we get this slow and sustained contractions, we've got the fiber type which is actually small in size. So type 1 fibers aren't actually conducive to great amounts of growth. Now, when it comes to some physiological characteristics of the type 1 fibers, you'll see that there is a high capillary density that surround those individual muscle fibers. And of course, a capillary is the smallest of the blood vessels where gaseous exchange and diffusion takes place. So if we've got more capillaries surrounding those individual fiber types, then of course we've got more oxygen being delivered into the mitochondria, and type 1 fibers have a lot of mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria is what's known as the powerhouse of the cell, and this is where all aerobic respiration takes place. Aerobic respiration is referring to producing energy in the presence of oxygen, and this is where all aerobic metabolism takes place in what's known as a mitochondrial cell. So us being able to use fat and carbohydrate as fuel in the presence of oxygen requires mitochondria in order to produce that energy. So of course, the more mitochondria we have, the more energy we're able to produce, and therefore sustain contraction without fatigue. In addition to that, we also have more aerobic enzyme concentration. So enzymes are things which break fuels down. So as I've just mentioned, we're using fat and carbohydrate for fuel. You wouldn't be able to use that without enzymes which break that fuel up that can then be converted into energy. So basically, the more enzymes we have, the more energy we're able to convert. Now, when it comes to sporting examples which require muscle fibers of a slow twitch or type 1 characteristic, we are therefore talking about long distance events or sports which take place or require sustained contractions over longer periods of time. So the go-to example, of course, when we're talking about type 1 fibers would be marathon running. Of course, we're running a marathon for 2, 3, 4 hours, and therefore require a sustained delivery of oxygen to these muscle fibers over long periods of time without fatigue. So the best examples, we're talking about long distance running. Of course, we can use other examples. For example, football, it takes place over 90 minutes, and therefore, again, we have to supply oxygen to those working muscles over an extended period of time. A game of rugby, which lasts 80 minutes, again, would require type 1 fibers to keep the body moving, to keep it functioning, producing energy, using oxygen over a long period of time. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, when it comes to muscle fiber types, we have what's known as a type 2X or type 2B fast twitch fiber. So fast twitch fibers, as the name suggests, are for more fast and explosive type activity. So the first thing that you'll notice about a type 2X fiber is the colour difference versus type 1 fibers. So the colour is white, and the reason for this is that because there is a much reduced blood supply to these type 2X fibers. And the reason for this is that they rely on anaerobic respiration in which to produce energy. Now, of course, aerobic means with oxygen, and anaerobic means without oxygen. So type 2X muscle fibers, which don't have the ability to wait for oxygen to be delivered, when we require fast, explosive and speedy contractions, we want to be able to rely on immediate energy sources and therefore not have to wait for oxygen to be delivered. Now, if we look at muscle fiber types from an evolutionary standpoint, your body's ability to produce fast, powerful contractions without having to wait for oxygen really was a survival mechanism, and a very important one at that, because if there was any stimulus that was presented to you that could be life-threatening, you didn't want to have to wait for oxygen, so your muscles have the ability to evade that particular threatening situation, whatever that may be. Now, because we may require energy very, very quickly and not have the time to wait for oxygen in a certain situation, your body's also developed the ability to store energy very close to those muscle fibers. So we've got the ability to store carbohydrate, which is known as glycogen, close to these fast twitch fibers so that they can draw upon that fuel and break that down and produce energy anaerobically very, very quickly for you to be able to produce those fast and powerful contractions. Now again, if we're talking about sporting examples here, when it comes to muscle fiber types, fast twitch fibers of course lend themselves to sports like the 100 meter sprint. So here we're producing energy anaerobically, over very short periods of time, and of course we can't sustain that speed of a 100 meter sprint over even double a distance. We can't do that over 200, 400, 800 meters. Our body just hasn't got the ability to sustain those powerful contractions. So the go-to sporting example for a type 2X muscle fiber would be the 100 meter sprint. And then lastly, in between a slow twitch fiber, type 1 fiber, and our fast twitch fiber, type 2X, we've got what's known as a type 2A fiber. So this really is a hybrid of those two and contains characteristics of both of those individual muscle fiber types. Because of this, it's pink in colour because it's both able to produce energy aerobically and anaerobically, but it's able to sustain more powerful contractions. Now, not to the same extent of a type 2X fiber and the force that they can produce, but still, they can produce a lot more force than a type 1 fiber. However, they're able to sustain that over greater periods of time. So the outstanding sporting example for a type 2A fiber would be middle distance running. So for example, the 800 meters, they're still going to be using oxygen over sustained periods of time, but the contractions have to be a lot more powerful over that period of time in order to be successful within that particular event. Of course, when we're talking about these individual muscle fiber types, we've given outstanding sporting examples, but of course, what about sports which require both? For example, if we talk about football, which takes place over a 90-minute period, then of course this lends itself to a type 1 fiber. But of course there are instances during a football game when you are required to sprint short distances, 50-50 tackle, getting up to head the ball, which therefore requires power from the leg muscles. These therefore require fast, powerful contractions intermittently throughout that period of time. So although we've been looking at each individual muscle fiber type in isolation, it's important to know that during sports performance, they will be innervated on a spectrum depending on the demand that you put on the muscle. So to conclude and finalise the muscle fiber section, there is a task in your workbooklet which I'd like you to complete now, identifying the different characteristics of each individual fiber type. So here you'll be asked about the colour of each individual fiber type, the contractile rate, whether aerobic or anaerobic respiration is predominant within that fiber, and also at the bottom, different sporting examples. Now, when you're writing down a fiber type for the individual sports, identify which fiber type you think would be predominant. Of course, we've just mentioned that at different times during different interplays of the sport, you'll require different fiber type innovation, but predominantly throughout the course of that entire event or throughout the course of that entire match, whatever it may be, give a fiber type which is predominant in your opinion. And the final part of the muscular system relates to origins and insertions. Origins and insertions are related to where the muscle attaches to the skeleton. So we said that of course movement occurs when muscle pulls on bone, but where the muscle attaches determines the movement that is available. This is particularly important for a personal trainer because when you are prescribing movement within your training program, you have to be able to identify where that movement is actually occurring from. This of course may help you to identify postural issues or any particular movement patterns that are incorrect when moving forward with your client. So if we look at first an origin, this is related to when the muscle attaches to the immovable bone. So this is essentially where the muscle or the part of the body will remain stationary during a given movement. The insertion is where the muscle is attached to the movable bone. So this is where the movement is occurring and therefore where the muscle is actually pulling on the bone. Now, we're not going to provide an exhaustive list and go through each one of the muscles, origins and insertions, but what we can do is we can provide that extra document for you to peruse in your own time. This again will help you to identify any potential movement flaws within your client and also be able to identify the muscles and parts of the body that are involved. So if we take, for example, the bicep brachii, which of course is at the front of the upper arm, we look at its origin, which is in the scapula. So the tendon, as we know, attaches muscle to bone, so it's the tendon which will go and attach to the scapula, and its insertion is at the radius. So as we know, when we do a bicep curl, it is the forearm which is doing predominantly most of the movement, and of course it's the upper arm and the scapula which is remaining stationary. So this basic knowledge here of the origin and the insertion tells us where that muscle is occurring, because where that muscle tendon attaches both at the origin and the insertion. And of course the action that we get, as we're aware and we've spoken about many times already, we get elbow flexion and we can also get some supination. Okay, so well done. That's the muscular system completed at level 2. We've been through all of those objectives that we outlined at the start of the lesson. Of course, now it's down to you to revise and to recap and to make sure that you have the content in your long-term memory. But just to help you along with that, there is a formative assessment which you can complete, 10 questions, multi-choice, very similar to what you'll be doing for your final examination in anatomy and physiology. So if you click on the link below, and this will take you to that formative assessment where you can test your knowledge and prepare for the exam. Good luck.